Welcome, everyone, to the OnPoli podcast. I'm Steve Paikin.
And I'm John Michael McGrath.
Today on the pod, Doug Ford has, for the moment, suspended Ontario's electricity surcharge after Donald Trump's Commerce Secretary offers an olive branch.
The Lieutenant Governor is swearing in a new cabinet next week. We'll tell you what to watch for.
The Supreme Court says the Ford government's election spending law was unconstitutional. We'll look at the implications of that decision.
And in your column, my column, I'll argue that the Tories should do something they probably don't want to do.
And my column is about the road ahead for the woman who was once the second most powerful politician in the country, but whose future today seems quite unclear.
It's Friday, March 14th, 2025, so let's get to it.
JMM, good to see you again, pal.
Good
Little
to see
sugar
you.
to start our episode, as always.
Yes.
Who are the X-Men exactly?
Well, if you have read any comic books ever or seen movies in the last 20 years, the X-Men have featured semi-prominently. And I was a big X-Men comics reader when I was a teenager. And this is another one of those T-shirts that my wife found. This is X-Men 97 is a recent cartoon, but it's like they brought the cartoon back from the version that it was in the 1990s. And I mean, the front of the T-shirt is a bit plain, but the back of the T-shirt has
you got some
all the
game
good
there.
artwork on it. So I'm very happy with this T-shirt.
Isn't Patrick Stewart one of the X-Men?
Indeed, he played Professor X, and he has, I guess, retired from that role, but for many iterations in the franchise.
But he was also Jean-Luc Picard on Star Trek.
Yes, and so
I can't keep up.
someday there will be a Star Trek X-Men crossover, and he will have to like punch himself in the face or something.
That's good.
And yourself.
Okay, so this shirt was given to me by a guy named Jaden Braves, who was on the agenda not too long ago. He's a young student activist, I think about 16 years old, and he had these shirts made up. And after all this crapola talk about Canada as the 51st state, Jaden thought, well, wouldn't it be better if we just talked about America as the 11th province?
Yes.
So given that you may have heard something about some sticky relations between Canada and the United States right now.
Indeed, I have, yes.
This just feels like the right thing to be wearing these days.
I made a joke on Blue Sky, a similar discussion about bringing some American states into confederation, and I said, well, we're going to have to chase down the living descendants of the founding fathers and specifically make them all swear loyalty to the king.
I don't mind that idea either. I went to the Raptors game last night.
Yeah.
They played the Star Spangled Banner at the beginning of the game. Guess what happened?
People did not follow the premier's advice not to boo.
Correct. Lots of booing. And I want, you know what, anybody who's from the state, believe it or not, we got people from the States who actually watch this or listen to this. And of course, almost all the Toronto Raptors are Americans. You've got a few Canadians, but a lot of American athletes who come here. We're not booing you.
Yeah.
We're not booing Americans. We're not booing American athletes. We're booing Trump. I mean, that's the fact. We're booing Trump and his attempt to take us over. So just, I know the Premier has offered his admonition that we not boo the national anthem of the United States, but we're booing Donald. It's as simple as that.
You've said we are booing, and I'm going to put you on the record here, sir. You joined in the booing.
You know, as it was happening, the first thing I did, of course, was get my iPhone out and record it so I could tweet it, because I thought, this
Ever a journalist.
This is a phenomenon, and I want to capture this and put it out there. And then I think when they got to "in the land of the free," then I joined. I have to confess, I did join, because I think, like most 40 million Canadians, I'm not happy by what I'm seeing going on down there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, okay, let's talk about, today being Friday, got a new Prime Minister of the country today, sworn in. Mark Carney is the 24th Prime Minister of Canada. I am, call me old-fashioned here, but I am always impressed when I see moments of civility in politics because they seem to be so rare. Doug Ford, Ontario Premier, congratulated Mark Carney after the leadership convention last weekend on his convention win. And he also, in his press release, thanked Justin Trudeau for his almost 10 years as Prime Minister and his contributions to Canada. There is the obligatory line in the press release that says, while we didn't always agree on everything, which for whatever reason they feel they need to say, there was also just sort of the simple acknowledgement that, the guy had his hits, the guy had his misses, but, thank you for what you tried to do for the country. Yeah. I never thought that there was any harm in being civil to your political opponents. So I was glad to see that the Premier's office released that statement with some compliments in there for two gentlemen who are in not Doug Ford's party.
Yes.
And There we go. And they had breakfast together, right? Carney and Ford had breakfast together.
Yes, they met at a diner in Etobicoke, and they seem to have had I think we've got a photo from the Premier's Twitter account. A lot of things we could say about this. A nice civil discussion, one hopes, between a sitting head of government and a incoming head of government, or I guess he now is. And I also just want to say, I love a good diner breakfast. I'm just going to go off of the political track here for a moment. One of my rituals on election days, when you and I, as we had to just a few weeks ago, when we have a late night, I start off my day, I find a diner somewhere, and I have a plate of Eggs Benedict.
Wow,
and
that's your tradition.
That is my, I vote first thing, and then after voting, I go and I find a diner, and I have Eggs Benedict, and I really, really love a good diner breakfast.
The only comment I'd make about this picture is they seem a little overdressed for an early morning diner, you know? I mean, suits and ties, it's a bit
I hope
over the
they
top.
Didn't spill any of their coffee on those nice clothes.
Exactly. We actually have a kind of an intriguing situation in the country right now and in this province right now, in as much as the leader of the provincial Liberals, Bonnie Crombie, does not have a seat.
Yes.
And the leader of the federal Liberals, Mark Carney, does not have a seat. I'm not sure the last time that happened, but it's happening right now. So, any clues as to where Mark Carney is going to plant his flag?
Well, I mean, there's a few rumors that have been tossed around. There was some discussion, I think, of him running in Ottawa Centre. Yasser Naqvi is the nominated candidate for the Liberals in that riding, so he would have to be asked to step aside. There has also been some discussion of Toronto Centre, where Chrystia Freeland is.
No, she's University of Rosedale.
Oh, I'm sorry, you're right.
But Marcy Ian, who's in Toronto Centre,
Yes.
is not standing again. So that's going to be a vacant riding as well.
And so, it is within Mark Carney's power to say to any sitting Liberal MP, like, hey, I need
want
you to
your
step
seat.
aside.
Yeah.
But the other alternative is that they might all be stepping aside by the Prime Minister's advice to the Governor General. Like, he could call for a snap election.
Well, there you go. What about Mississauga East Cooksville? You think he'll run there? That's just a bad joke.
I wouldn't recommend it, honestly. It hasn't been great luck for the Liberals lately.
That's just a bad joke. Let's get out of here. Off to issue 1, everybody. On Monday, the province of Ontario enacted its 25% surcharge on electricity exports to several U.S. states. On Tuesday, Donald Trump said he'd impose a 50% tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum. And then, like the words in that old song, both men said, let's call the whole thing off. The tit-for-tat trade war seems to be heating up and cooling down all at the same time. But I'll tell you this, we have no doubt now about whether Donald Trump knows who the premier of Ontario is. That's how they pronounce premier in the United States. You notice that? They always call him the premier.
You think we're going to be able to educate them on the proper pronunciation of lieutenant?
I think we should try. I think it's worth a try. Anyway, what'd you make of all that?
Well, Trump did make some comments about appreciating Ford's willingness to drop the electricity surcharge. Went on to say how strong Ford was acting and that he appreciated his actions. And then, of course, he went and imposed a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum. Anyway, that is not as large as the 50% he was talking about, but it's still a real blow to the steel sector in Ontario, particularly, and aluminum across Canada.
I think you got to admit there's more bark than bite in the attempt to put 25% surcharges on Ontario's electricity exports to the United States. It's not very much money at the end of the day, right?
Right. The government said that they estimated it would collect $400,000 a day, which, like, if it had stayed in place for a year, that might have added up to a somewhat substantial sum. But as it was, I think it was in place for like a day, maybe less. And so it just did not add up to a ton of money for very large electricity consumers. Again, if it had stayed in place for a very long time, it might have added up to a substantial amount. But as I said last week, we just actually don't sell that much electricity to the Americans for this kind of thing to matter. That said, the premier stuck to his guns here a little bit, and he did initially go ahead with this, tried to force the president to back down on tariffs. That has not happened so far, but what it has done is clearly, I mean, we've already seen the evidence that the American administration knows who Doug Ford is, knows the demands that Ontario is making. And I think it's important to say, knows that there's not a lot of daylight between the federal government and at least the largest provinces. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick has been on the phone with Doug Ford apparently multiple times. Probably helps that Doug Ford is all over American television these days.
Almost every day.
Yeah.
It's really something.
Sometimes multiple times a day, right? We know actually on Thursday, Doug Ford was in Washington to have that meeting with the Commerce Secretary, accompanied by federal cabinet ministers as well. By the time this goes to air on TV, I do fear that facts will have changed yet again. So apologies to our viewers if we are behind the times on this one, but the situation is just so very fluid right now.
Yeah, it seems to change by the minute.
Yeah.
Now, we know that Premier Ford has not only told the people who are in charge of procurement for the Ontario government, which works out to multiple billions of dollars worth of business every year, but also to Ontario's 444 municipalities, that they really should try to shop Canadian, buy Canadian, use your procurement power to avoid purchasing goods and services from the United States and try and keep it home. I noticed you went to a news conference this past week in which the Premier and his Energy Minister, I guess it was on Monday, were talking about this electricity surcharge that he was initially going to put on them. And I got to say, I liked your question about, well, is the Ontario government actually going to put its money where its mouth is as it relates to nuclear power? What'd you find out?
Right. So there's two issues here. One is the small modular reactors that we are building at Darlington. The construction here is underway. They have cleared the land, and I believe later this year they're going to start pouring the concrete for these new reactors. But this is an American design. It is not part of the CANDU system of reactors that we have relied on traditionally in Ontario. And, a few years ago, people can go back. I wrote something for TVO about how this was a notable change, but it was not a bad idea. It didn't seem like a bad idea several years ago. But there are some real questions to ask right now about do we want to be dependent on American design?
What's the company? It's GE Hitachi, I think?
GE Hitachi is building, it's their design for the SMRs. And crucially, I think, it relies on enriched uranium fuel that we don't make in Canada. CANDU doesn't require enriched uranium, so we've never developed that capacity here. I asked the energy minister, before we get to pouring concrete and putting, actual putting the parts together for this thing, are we going to discuss canceling this contract and potentially going another direction? Minister Lecce says no. The government believes that they have signed, contracts that are sufficiently advantageous to Ontario that we're not going to be put at risk. There's another issue, but that is not as far advanced as the SMRs, but is one worth discussing, and that's the very large reactor. This is not a small modular reactor. This is now a large reactor that they plan to build up in Bruce. It would be Site C is what they're calling it. And the government has not dictated to Bruce Power, which is a private company, what technology to choose. My understanding is that as of yet, Bruce has not chosen a reactor technology, but it is possible that they might also choose to not go with a CANDU design, and they might go with a different American design. There's one by Westinghouse that, it has the benefit of existing, and the most current CANDU design does not currently exist. So, there's reasons why they might want to go with Westinghouse. But again, it raises this question of, do we want to make ourselves dependent on American designs? Again, the energy minister says he's not dictating choices to Bruce Power. That's what they're saying this week. Again, see what we said earlier about facts are fluid, and whether this stays the government's position several months from now, who knows? It
is interesting that with the Elon Musk Starlink contract, the government of Ontario made a big deal of saying it was ripping up that contract, $100 million contract to provide broadband to rural and northern Ontario. That contract apparently is dead.
Yeah.
But these ones on nuclear power still very much alive.
Yeah, and they are much larger contracts. We're talking about billions of dollars, not hundreds of millions. And they are, certainly the SMR one is further along. And it is also enmeshed, if I can use that word, in a lot of other agreements, both with American companies and also other provinces. We are developing the SMRs here in Ontario. In one of the hopes is that other provinces will want to use that technology as well. So yeah, like I am not suggesting that it would be easy or straightforward to walk away from the SMR contract. It would in fact be very difficult and potentially very painful. But if we're talking about protecting Canadian interests, that might be a discussion that we have to have before very long.
Well, it just goes to show you how difficult it is to disentangle ourselves from doing business with the United States. As much as we may want to do that right now, it'll either be very expensive to do it or impossible to do it because some of the stuff that they make, we need, and vice versa.
And it shouldn't be necessary.
Well, that's the bottom line, right? Exactly right. And with that, let's get off to issue 2. Doug Ford and his new cabinet will be sworn in on March the 19th, and the legislature will return for the first session of the 44th Parliament on April 14th. The Premier's new cabinet, how much is it likely to look like the old cabinet? What are we thinking here?
Well, so the Progressive Conservative Party only lost 2 sitting members, or I guess former sitting members, during the election, Christine Hogarth and Patrice Barnes. Neither were cabinet ministers. So you don't have the necessity to fill a bunch of holes in the cabinet. We might not see a ton of changeover. The government, at least for these immediate post-election periods, the government often just wants to portray like a bit of a status quo, steady as she goes vibe. And so they might shuffle some people around, but I'm not necessarily expecting a ton of new faces. It's notable here that we're going to get this new cabinet next week, but the legislature itself is not returning until mid-April. They do not seem to be in a terrible hurry to bring the legislature back. I think part of that is, frankly, what the Premier has said. Like, it turns out that a lot of the things that they thought they might have needed the legislature for, including that 25% hydro surcharge, they found a way to do it without bringing the legislature back.
Yeah, cabinet can just pass regulations, do it that way.
Yeah, exactly. The cabinet still has all these powers, and particularly when it comes to the electricity sector, the Minister of Energy has broad powers to just give directives to the parts of the energy system that we just own. So, they don't need the legislature yet. They do eventually need to bring a budget forward, but they're in no hurry.
Can I follow up on that?
Yeah,
because the fiscal year for the province of Ontario, actually, make your own joke here, it's April Fool's Day, right?
Yes.
The new year starts, the new fiscal year starts on April 1st, and the legislature is not going to actually return until after that. So, okay, how do they handle all that? We getting a budget? Or are we not getting a budget? And when are we getting it, et cetera?
Right. So the Premier has said, yes, they intend to bring in a budget in April. I imagine at least that they won't wait that long after they bring the legislature back. We don't have a ton of hints yet as to what will be in the budget beyond, for example, like campaign promises, right? Maybe we get some more details about that tunnel under the 401 that the Premier was so fond of. I expect we'll get some fleshed out measures to help assist sectors that have been affected by tariffs, maybe protect other sectors in advance before more tariffs come. It's worth noting that Trump has promised reciprocal tariffs on April 2nd. We still don't know what the shape of those are going to be for Canada, but it will be yet another thing that the province will have to respond to. He also, the Premier also promised during the election to remove the minimum retail cost of alcohol. That is because all alcohol regulations go through the finance ministry in this province. That is another thing that might get introduced in the budget, as well as making the cut to gas taxes that has been temporary but renewed many, many times in a row now. They have promised to finally make that permanent. And so that would be another measure that we might see in the budget.
Gotcha. And with that, we're off to issue 3. Last week, the Supreme Court of Canada killed Doug Ford's election spending law, which imposed spending limits on third-party advertising 12 months prior to an election call. Okay, fascinating decision. You want to take us through it?
Right. So this is a law that has been before the courts many, many times now. It was initially ruled unconstitutional back in the fall of 2021, if I remember correctly. The government then reintroduced it using the notwithstanding clause. As you say, the law imposed spending limits on third parties, and in the law, when we say third party, we just mean anybody who is not a registered political party. So, like political parties, and then the rest of the universe had a pretty tight spending cap. It was $600,000 for the year preceding the start of a provincial general election. The premier said at the time that this law was necessary to protect Ontario democracy from American-style super PACs.
But in effect, the real reason was...
Well, we'll get to that.
Okay.
Don't get ahead of us here. So, as I say, the court had initially struck down the law, saying that it violated the charter rights to free speech. Government reintroduces it, uses the notwithstanding clause, and it has made its way through the courts. And the Supreme Court of Canada ruled last Friday that the law was both so lopsided in its treatment of third parties and political parties, and it was so extensive that that full year before an election amounts to restricting a fundamental charter right for a quarter of the life of a legislature, right? So the Supreme Court ruled that the law was unconstitutional and could not be saved by any other provision of the Constitution.
When we say the Supreme Court decided, though, I think it was a 5-4 vote.
Yes.
Pretty tight.
Yes. And I mean, the dissenting opinions were very interesting. The majority said basically, no, law's unconstitutional. Then there was a pair of two justice dissenting opinions, one co-written by the Chief Justice, in fact, saying the Chief Justice and his joint dissent said basically, no, the law is constitutional. Yes, there's an infringement of some rights here, but it's savable. Basically, it's addressing a real purpose. And then the second dissent said, in fact, it was quite abrupt with the majority decision, saying like, no, this is you've got it all wrong. This law is constitutional, and in particular said because the legislature had invoked the notwithstanding clause that this was the court kind of overstepping its bounds. So.
Now, of course, the irony of this decision is these were supposed to be restrictions put in place in time to affect the next election.
Yes.
But the next election we just had.
Yes.
Because, of course, Doug Ford called the election 16 months before he had to. So where does that leave everything?
Well, so the law would not have been in effect for the last election anyway, and now it won't be in effect for the next election because it was struck down. In principle, the legislature could just decide to do nothing, and we would still have spending limits for third parties during that writ period, that 5-week election period. And those spending limits would bind both political parties and third parties. But if the government wants to bring in a new law, thanks to the number of times this issue has been before a judge, we actually have a good idea of like what a charter compliant law would look like. It would be, instead of a year, it would look more like maybe a 6-month time frame, and you would have to, at least going by the majority decision in the Supreme Court, you would have to have a bit more of an equal spending cap between political parties and third parties. It doesn't seem like it would necessarily have to be dollar for dollar equal, but something closer would probably pass judicial review.
Can I circle back now to the real reason why this law was
Yes,
brought in the first place?
That in.
Okay, fire away, because the real reason was...
Yes, the real reason that it was not American-style super PACs, right? This law, and everybody acknowledged from the beginning, this law was targeting groups like the Working Families Coalition. This was an alliance of public and private sector unions that had successfully run ads against the Conservative Party in multiple election cycles, to the very large benefit of the Ontario Liberal Party from at least 2003 to 2014. Everybody in Ontario politics acknowledged that the Liberals benefited enormously from those ads, and
which were attack ads on the Tories, basically.
Right, and it was money that the Liberal Party didn't have to spend,
right,
and they, keep their hands a little bit clean. And what I think is really interesting here, when we talk about what law might come next, is Doug Ford no longer has to deal with the same labor coalition, right? The Conservative Party has made real inroads with at least some private construction sector unions, and that whole, literally, Patrick Dillon, the guy who was the head of the Working Families Coalition and was a named party in this Supreme Court case, he endorsed Doug Ford in the 2022 election.
He's pals with Doug Ford
Right.
now. Yeah. Corey tonight calls him a great friend.
Yeah. So, simply put, the politics of 2018, 2019, 2020, they are no longer the same politics that we have in 2025. So if the Tories do bring in a new spending law, it's not going to be to address the same political priorities that they once had.
Now, for the constitutional nerds watching this, we have a decision from the Supreme Court,
Yes.
which the government of Ontario doesn't like.
Yes.
Could the government of Ontario use the notwithstanding clause again to set aside this court decision?
No, and I think this is a really key point. We're going to do a little bit of basic civics here before we close out this section, right? You can't use the notwithstanding clause on every part of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. There are certain rights that are excluded from the notwithstanding clause, including the right to vote. And what was really important in this decision was the majority decision said this is not just an infringement of the right to free expression, which you can use the notwithstanding clause on. This is so dramatic a restriction that it infringes the right to vote itself, and that you cannot use the notwithstanding clause on. So the government cannot bring this exact same law back and try to use the notwithstanding clause. The Supreme Court, I think in that case, you'd have more than just a 5-4 majority from the Supreme Court saying, like, no, stop playing games.
So the Supreme Court got the last word this time.
This time they did, yes.
Gotcha. And with that, let's get off to your column, my column. Okay, everyone, this is the time of our program where we bring you our regular feature, Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I reminisce about what we wrote for TVO.org over the past week. What do you want to start us off with?
I'm going to start with a question, Steve.
Yes.
What do electoral reform and corner store beer have in common?
Electoral reform and corner store beer. Okay, electoral reform is never going to happen. Corner store beer took 40 years to happen, so at least that did happen.
Right.
Is that the right answer?
Well, not quite. At least it's not the answer I was looking for.
Okay, yeah.
I would say these are two long-standing controversies in the province of Ontario, and where discussion has waxed and waned but never ended entirely. Okay. And Premier Ford acted on corner store beer and wine, and that meant he got to get the credit for it, and he got to shape the system that Ontario would eventually adopt because he was the one making the decision. And so my argument in the column this week is that he should do the same thing with electoral reform, that I think in large part because of the very odd results that the Liberal Party got in the most recent election, where they got 30% of the vote and only, I did the math for this, but it's like 15% of the seats or something, right? A lot of Liberals, I think, are going to start talking about electoral reform much more seriously, frankly, than they ever have before, at least in my lifetime, right? They've never had this inefficient a vote result, if you want to call it that. So I think after the next time a Liberal government is formed, they're going to be serious about this, or they could very well be. And that presents Doug Ford with a choice. He could either let the next government implement its own version of electoral reform, or he could beat them to the punch. And then he would be making the choice on behalf of the PC party. He could ensure that whatever system is brought in to reform our first past the post system doesn't really adversely affect the interests of the PC party. It will still have to comply for the charter, so he can't just do whatever he wants. But he can both take the issue off the table from progressive parties and shape the outcome at least a little bit to his advantage. I don't think he's going to.
I was just going to say, or he could do absolutely nothing, which is what every other party in the past has done,
yes,
because they all win on the current system. So
yes,
if you're winning with the current system, why would you change it?
Well, and this is why I think we are going to see more energy among the Liberals, because it's not like in every other previous election. Yeah, they might win or they might lose, but they've never had this disproportionate a result where they got a substantial vote share and got so few seats. The other thing, and I didn't mention this in the column, but I am going to throw it up here, we almost certainly have to talk about seat reapportionment in this current legislature, right? If this legislature lasts the full 4 years, it'll be 2029 in the next election. The last time the apportionment change was for the 2018 election. So we'll be talking about a legislature that's now 10 years out of date, at least.
Basically, you mean going to the federal boundaries?
Well, presumably they would, if they follow past precedent or recent past precedent, they would adopt the federal boundaries for Southern Ontario and leave the northern boundaries basically unaffected. They could choose to do something different if they want, but they probably can't just not do anything.
Right.
And so since we'll be talking about seat reapportionment, and I think there's going to be some people who say, like, look, while you're doing this, let's at least talk about voting reform.
Yeah, makes sense.
And how about you, Steve?
Okay, I wrote 2 columns the past week, and one of them was about the guy who came first in the federal Liberal leadership, and one of them was about the woman who came second in the federal Liberal leadership. So let's take these on. I went to Ottawa last weekend for the Mark Carney convention, and some of the echoes to a previous convention that I attended in Ottawa 41 years ago, I mean, those echoes were everywhere. What do they say? History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. Okay, there was a lot of rhyming going on there. Can we bring this picture up? This was, that was me 41 years ago as a somewhat younger and longer-haired reporter covering the convention, which picked John Turner on the second ballot. And here we go with the echoes. John Turner walked into that convention as the prohibitive favorite, and he won it easily. Mark Carney walked into this convention as the prohibitive favorite. He won it very easily. John Turner was a big star in the business world, who had been a previous Minister of Finance for Pierre Trudeau. Mark Carney had been a superstar in the business world, having been a central banker, and will now take over from Justin Trudeau as the leader of the party. The party was in terrible shape when John Turner took it over from Pierre Trudeau. The party has been in terrible shape as Mark Carney takes it over from Justin Trudeau, although in both cases, I note, the 2 new leaders really closed that gap between themselves and the Progressive Conservatives already. It was a big victory for Turner back then until the election was called, snap election, and then Turner led the Liberals to their worst showing ever. Obviously, we are waiting for the next shoe to fall for Mark Carney to call what we presume will be a snap election, and we'll see how he does against somebody who was a pretty popular Conservative leader for a good long chunk of time in Pierre Poilievre. So those echoes fascinated me, and that was column 1, and I encourage everybody to look at that. The second column I wrote was about the woman who came second, and that was Chrystia Freeland. She was the second most powerful politician in the country for 5 years as Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance for Justin Trudeau. She had a hand in probably darn near every significant policy initiative that this government made, right? From a national child care program to a robust position on the war with Ukraine, to the renewed free trade negotiations the first time around. What do we call it? CUSMA? Is that what they call it?
Yeah.
CUSMA? Canada, U.S., USMACA, whatever you want to call it. Yeah. It all fell apart. It fell apart, rather, of course, last December when she was asked by Justin Trudeau to read the fall economic statement and then resign to make way for Mark Carney. She found that quite objectionable. She resigned. In doing so, she put just, what turned out to be an unbearable amount of pressure on Justin Trudeau, forcing him to stand down. So it's so interesting in politics how many times you see this, that the person who takes their sword out of its sheath and kills the king is actually rarely the one who becomes the next king, or in this case, the queen. And so the gist of my column is, will Chrystia Freeland come back and serve in a Mark Carney government, or is this really the end of the road for her political career, and what options are there? And I suggest some in the piece. So there's that.
Can I throw in one thing very quickly here?
Please.
Just say, I think over the last year, you and I have referred to federal polling and the likelihood of Pierre Poilievre being the next prime minister. And I think we're always relatively careful to say if the current polling continues.
Right.
And we're very careful about that because the current polling did not continue.
Right.
If you look at just today and in the last few days, right, the Liberals and the Tories are back to like neck and neck in some polls.
Statistical tie.
And so
that 20-point gap that the Conservatives enjoyed for a long time has disappeared.
Yeah,
but it could come back during a campaign.
It absolutely could. We say campaigns matter. We say a week is a long time in politics. All of these things are cliches, but they're also true.
Right. Okay, that's enough of us. Let's get to the mailbag, shall we? Because if you've got a burning question or insightful comment, we always love hearing from you at onpolitics@tvo.org. JMM, start us off if you would.
So we have a question here from Ben Hearsom in Richmond Hill, who has written to us before, a repeat listener. He writes, "Hi, with Mark Carney having been chosen as leader of the Liberal Party of Canada, he either is or will be the next Prime Minister of Canada. My question is, when exactly does that happen and by what mechanism? I understand the Governor-General will invite Carney to Rideau Hall at some point after Trudeau has resigned. Is Carney the PM after that, or is it only after a successful throne speech? Is there a scenario in which Carney might not officially become Prime Minister prior to the next election? Thanks, Ben in Richmond Hill.
Okay, Ben, this is a great question because it allows John Michael and me to sort of nerd out on our civics here, because we have seen a lot of misreporting over the past week. So let's get the chronology right here. Last Sunday, the Liberals had their leadership convention in Ottawa. Mark Carney won. At that moment, he is the leader of the Liberal Party, but that's it.
Yeah.
He will become the next Prime Minister of Canada, but he did not become the Prime Minister of Canada just by winning that convention. I've seen him reported over the past week using the title Prime Minister Designate.
Yeah.
He has not been the Prime Minister Designate over the past week.
Yeah.
He did not become the Prime Minister Designate of the country until he met with Mary Simon, the Governor-General, at which time she designates him to be the next Prime Minister.
Yes.
Then he's the Prime Minister Designate. And it's not until, I assume he's going to do this, it's not until he puts his hand on the Bible and takes the oath and swears allegiance to the King and to faithfully execute the powers and, anyway, to do the office. And that's when he becomes the Prime Minister of the country. Not when he brings in a throne speech, not when he runs for election. Yeah. So he's incoming Prime Minister for that whole past week. When he meets with Mary Simon, she designates him. He then becomes the Prime Minister Designate. And when he swears the oath of office and brings in his cabinet for swearing in as well, which happened today, that's when he becomes the 24th Prime Minister of the country.
And it's worth saying that there's no requirement that the designation and the naming of the new cabinet happen on the same day. I believe in 2018 when Premier Ford won, he met with the lieutenant governor, and then there was a span of some time before the premier and his cabinet were then sworn in. They did that big public ceremony on the front lawn of Queen's Park. So you can be the premier or prime minister designate for some extended period before you are sworn in and become formally the prime minister. Then, of course, there's this question alluded to in Ben's question about, could he be the prime minister until introducing a throne speech, or because, of course, the House is prorogued. So if they bring the House back, there will need to be a throne speech as the first order of business. We also said this earlier on the podcast, right? There is I think, a strong possibility that Carney may not call the House back at all. He may, as maybe one of his first orders of business, ask the Governor-General to dissolve Parliament and call a snap election. Again, a case of history rhyming with the John Turner example. If he were to win that election, he would be the fourth. It would be the fourth consecutive election victory for the Liberals since 2015. And if he loses, he could become the shortest-serving prime minister of all time in Canadian history, beating Sir Charles Tupper's record, who was in office for a mere 68 days.
Yeah, these, again, if we're going to talk historical rhyming here, 1968, Pierre Trudeau wins his convention, doesn't bring the House back, calls a snap election, turns a minority government that he inherited from Lester Pearson into a majority. Yeah. That worked out well. John Turner tried to turn the same trick in 1984, right? Won the convention, didn't bring the House back, called a snap election, didn't have a seat, like Mark Carney. Right. Didn't work out, got thrashed. So now Mark Carney seems like he's going to call a snap election, doesn't have a seat. We shall see how that all works out. Could make history for good for good reasons and for bad reasons.
Yeah, well, I suspect one way or the other.
One way or the other is exactly right. We got another listener email here, so let's pick this one up. We've got a Tom Beltrame in Mississauga. Why don't you take us through this one?
Right. Tom writes, "Hello, big fan of the pod here and longtime viewer of TV Out, going back to when I would watch Studio 2 after school.
Oh, I remember that
I just have a question about something that's been making the rounds this week. A photographer for Reuters, Carlos Osorio, took a photo of Justin Trudeau leaving Parliament carrying his House of Commons chair. Is this some kind of Canadian political tradition akin to new shoes for the finance minister on budget day, or did Trudeau literally steal a chair? Thanks for your time and keep up the great work with the podcast." Tom from Mississauga.
Okay, there's the shot. You know what was clever about this is that the photographer, let's remember, this is day one of Mark Carney showing up to Parliament Hill as the incoming prime minister, not yet prime minister designate, but incoming prime minister. And all the photographers, all the reporters are all with Carney. Carlos Osorio was so smart, he decided he's going to be the one guy to watch what's going on in the House. And he's the one guy who gets this picture of Justin Trudeau taking his chair out of the House of Commons and, of course, doing a little
mugging for the camera.
Something his father might have done, sticking his tongue out at the photographer as he's been caught in the action. But the reality is, he's not doing anything wrong here. The reality is, anybody who serves in the House of Commons who sat in their chair is allowed to take the chair with them or buy a replica of it before they leave. So, no, he's not stealing anything.
No.
You have to buy it, right? You got to buy it. I think, how much is it? It's like $2,000?
Oh, yeah.
Something like that?
Forget, yeah.
I think it's $2,300 or something like that.
Yeah, it's not cheap because these are good chairs. And good furniture is expensive, something I've learned as I've grown older. God, I love these traditions. I love I actually did not know about this one, but I love these kinds of traditions that are attached to parliamentary tradition. I think we've probably mentioned before, like when an MPP wins their seat in a by-election and they get brought before the speaker to take their seat, and there's this whole little ceremony where they get introduced to the House and they ask for the right to take their seat. When a speaker is elected and the leader of the governing party and the opposition party have to physically drag the person into the speaker's chair. You know
why?
Well, because back in the bad old days, before Parliament had won its battle for supremacy, the Speaker was sometimes the person who had to arrange for the little defense of the House of Commons against the King, and sometimes they lost their head doing it.
Right.
So yeah, no, I love these traditions so much, and I saw some people have some very oddly negative reactions to the Trudeau, and okay, he's making a bit of a goofy face in this photo, and some people thought that didn't look quite serious enough for a man who was, as the taking of that picture, still the Prime Minister. But I think more charitably, you could just say, like, he knows that he's on his way out. He said when he announced his decision to leave that he would not be running again in the next election. And this is just one of those things that he's doing on his way out. And I mean, great photo, and I love the tradition. I
got a couple of quick stories here I want to lay on you. Number one of the quite lovely but admittedly nerdy souvenirs that I have. Sometimes you see this in the House of Commons or the Ontario Legislature, some people bring lecterns in with them. So if they're giving a speech, it can lift the paper sort of closer up to their eyes, and they put the speech on there and they read it. I have John Robarts's lectern that he used in the 1960s in the Ontario Legislature. He gave it to a friend of his. That friend gave it to me because I wrote a book about Robarts, and he therefore thought I should have it. So I have John Robarts's lectern that he used in the Ontario Legislature, which is kind of sweet. Here's an even better story. You saw the picture of me covering the John Turner Convention from 1984. John Turner was in the House of Commons on two different occasions. He first got elected in the early 1960s and then served until 1975 when he resigned. Then went to the private sector for a decade, came back in 84, led his party to two election defeats at the hands of Brian Mulroney, and stayed then until 1993, I guess. He had his chair from the House of Commons, and he, as Justin Trudeau did, took it with him after he left. He then, later in his life, called his great friend Arthur Milnes from Kingston, Ontario. Arthur is a bit like us. He's a bit of a nerd for political history. And he called him up one day. He said, "Arthur, who lives in Kingston, come to Toronto tomorrow. I want to give you something." Arthur said, "What's this all about?" He says, "Just get your ass down here before I change my mind." Arthur drives to Toronto, where Mr. Turner lived the next day, and he sees him in the lobby of his apartment building, sitting on his House of Commons chair. Arthur says, "Mr. Turner, what's going on here?" Mr. Turner says, "This is the chair I sat in the House of Commons for many years. I want to give it to you." And Arthur says, "Why?" And Mr. Turner says, "Because you will value it." And if you go to Arthur Milnes's home in Kingston, Ontario, and you go into his little office, you will see him sitting in John Turner's chair, which he sat in the House of Commons. I think that's as good as it gets when it comes to souvenirs.
All right. And with that, I'll just give the email again. If you would like to ask about content on the show, you can email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
And that is the On Poly podcast for this Friday, March 14th, 2025.
You can follow our show on Apple Podcasts so you get notified each time a new episode is available, and you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Any feedback you have, we're always happy to hear it, good, bad, or indifferent. Write us an email at onpolitics@tvo.org and be sure to include your first and last name and where you're from.
This week's episode was produced and edited by Matthew O'Mara, video editing by Colin Kish.
Production support from Christy McLeod and TVO's Digital Media Services team.
Our managing editor is Katie O'Connor. Lori Few is the executive producer of Digital. John Ferry is vice president, programming and content.
Special thanks, as always, to our wonderful studio crew for making the video part of this podcast happen. And until next Friday, everybody, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.